So you're probably expecting that I'm going to show a bunch of slides from, I call them slides, there you go, a bunch of images from my travels around the world, but I think you're going to see that from a lot of people, and I'm actually not going to do that. I want to try to raise your understanding of creativity and the process of making a better image or improving your photography. I got to get used to the screen. So, number one, writing something down, you have a 72% better retention rate. So, take notes. We actually only take in 10% of what we see. And it's fascinating for me to watch photographers when they shoot, because what they do is this. Take the camera, and then they start going like this. And that, to me, is a perfect indication of someone that doesn't know the world around them. And the first time they're seeing that world is when they actually look through the lens, as opposed to really processing all the information around you. So, I'm very weird. Jay can attest to that. One of the things that I do when I walk is I stop and I close my eyes. And I try to recall, very simply, what's around me. Because when it comes to shooting, it then becomes, and I'll be politically incorrect, but it's much more like hunting. If I know that I have two colors behind me that work, and I know what's over here and I know what's over there, I can take the camera, pick it up, and pick them off. That is very different than just holding the camera up and going like this and trying to figure out what lens, waiting for some magic to happen, as opposed to creating an image. And that brings me to what I'm talking about, which is creativity. And I love the Webster's definition of creativity. And the key word there is original. And I see so much stuff photographically that's an imitation of something I've seen before. It's really interesting to find something that's truly original or a new viewpoint. I love going to like the national parks, not to make the postcards that everyone else has made, but to challenge myself to try and go find something truly different or a unique perspective. Going to Morocco and photographing people, really tough to photograph people. I actually had the pleasure of showing some images to Jay the other night, and you could take the easy route, or you can figure out a way to make this work. And that's a real central part of the idea of creativity. So you have to ask yourself, do you meet that definition? Second part for me that's important about photography is inspiration. I'll say it 100 times, but I look at his work, and it totally has, since I've been a little kid, inspired me. And it's wonderful to be inspired by someone, to have a mentor. The definition is the process of being mentally stimulated or feel something, especially to do something creative, which then comes back to an idea that's original. And you hear all the time photographers talking about being creative and inspired. And when you really look up the definition, not to bring you down, but I know a lot of photographers that don't meet those definitions. And it's a good reason to look within on how do you boost this, how do you change the process to make yourself more inspired, more creative. Failure is one of the keys to success. And one of the quotes I love the best is Thomas Edison. I have not failed, I've just found 10,000 ways it won't work. And it's through failure that you actually find success. To succeed, you must fail and fail more. Thomas Watson from IBM. The fastest way to succeed is to double your failure rate. Only those who dare to fail greatly can ever achieve greatly. And I make a goal of failure. When I go out, I expect that I want to totally fail enough times so that I figure out what it's going to take to make it work. And anyone that goes out there and doesn't take any chances and brings back, and I'll call them contest shots, that's all you're going to get out of it. And yeah, it might win a contest, and it might have some of the key elements, but you have to feel it in here. And to feel it in here takes failure. Jay was asking me about doing a book, and I said one of my issues with doing a book is I always feel like the picture I'm going to take tomorrow is going to need to be on the cover of the book, so I never want to do that. And, you know, Bresson said your first 10,000 photographs are your worst. Ansel Adams, there's nothing worse than a brilliant image of a fuzzy concept. And which of my photographs is my favorite? The one I'm going to take tomorrow. And I really believe in that, because you want to go out each time and try to up the ante of what you did before. So the real start of my presentation is on defining, and this is what most photographers can't do. Most photographers cannot tell you what they do. I'm a wildlife photographer. That doesn't tell me anything. I'm a travel photographer. That doesn't tell me anything. And I remember being questioned by someone, and they said, what do you do? And I said, well, I do a lot of different stuff photographically. Sometimes I photograph wildlife. Oh, so you work for National Geographic? No, I have, but I don't really do that. You photograph people? Yeah, I do a lot of people. So like People Magazine? No, not really People Magazine. Well, then the only thing left is a paparazzi. No, I'm definitely not a paparazzi. And I realized we have an inability, most of us, to actually talk about what it is we actually do. If you go to a museum, look at any of the classic painters. You can tell a Monet a mile away without looking at the signature. You also can differentiate between what his vision is and what his style was. Same goes for Picasso, Rembrandt, the list goes on and on and on. Very few photographers, unfortunately, can you look at and tell the signature without reading it. So I have a vision statement. It changes almost every day. And for me, it's an educational process. And back in the day, when I was photographing people, and a lot of my images were very up close, one of the things I said was that I enjoy breaking personal space. And I remember being in the Atacama Desert, which is South America, and I'm photographing a rock. And I start laughing at myself because it's not like this rock is talking back. And then I realize the rock actually is talking back. I actually feel something between the presence of this rock and myself. So I changed the word from breaking to entering. And it was really, a very simple word, but it really changed my relationship to the environment. I'm going to show you a little process of putting together a vision statement, and where I actually used images and talk about them. And I think it's really important for all of you to put on paper what you think your images are about and the process of how to get there. So I say that my subjects find me rather than me finding the subjects. And I'm really connecting with the energy. And if I look back, and I'm going to show you all the influences in my career, but I grew up for a long time loving Escher. It never occurred to me until I started to do this homework how much he influenced me. And I'm in the Atacama Desert. This is the Atacama. And, in the Atacama Desert, sorry. And I see this floating stone. And I actually remember going up to it and putting my hand underneath it to make sure it wasn't floating. People look at it and they say, so that's neat. What tool is that in Photoshop? There's no Photoshop. It looks floating. But it takes me back to loving Escher, where I understand where this comes from. Really interesting to look at everyone who's influenced you and see how that affects your work today. And it really has an impact. And the more you realize it, the more you get to up the ante and bring your own work up considerably. Antarctica, one of my favorite places. I go every year. part of what I want to do is explore what I call the fantasy of nature. And I look at this, and it represents so many things. And again, it takes me back to the artists that I loved and worked with, and addresses what I'm trying to address in my own work. If we again talk about altering reality, going to the desert in Namibia, which is another one of my favorite places, and thinking about metaphor. And I'm in a helicopter, I'm looking down on this sand dune, driest place on earth. They get almost no water in the past 100 years. And I don't see just a desert, I see a brain. I see a living desert rather than a dead desert. Again, takes me back to Escher, takes me back to a lot of the work that I studied, but it helps me understand, trying to come up with a metaphor for what I'm shooting. I actually see those metaphors. I am not shooting a sand dune, I am shooting a pulsating brain. And really, really neat to share your work. So many people assume it's Photoshop. My business partner, John Paul Caponegro, does a lot of Photoshop, and people will just look at this and go, so the white stuff, where did you take that from? I took that right from where it is. Well, no, but it's a sand dune. Right, but there's salt at the bottom of the sand dune. They don't believe it, and it's really magic to find this. Part of the reason you find it is because you feel it, and feeling is a really important part of trying to take your work further. Going to Puerto Vallarta, and extremely depressed, and I look at these horseshoes on a wall, and for me it doesn't represent the depression, it actually represents the livelihood that exists in this barrio. And Pete Turner was a big influence on me. I loved his use of just simple color. So many people would walk by this and barely see anything, or see just a horseshoe, or just a yellow, or nothing there at all. And for me, it really represented the vitality of what I found in this depressed barrio. Those are really special things to be able to develop that a lot of us don't get the chance to do, in part because we can't put on paper what our work is about. Going to New Zealand, and there's this place called the Moriaki Boulders. When I first got there, it was everything that I thought it was going to be. 100 photographers standing around 3 rocks, all in your way, all shooting the exact same picture. And I thought, why did I just travel this far to come to something that I knew was going to be exactly what it is? So I started to think, okay, number one, I don't want to shoot the same 3 rocks that everybody else was going to shoot. I'm going to walk further down the beach. And I walk down the beach, and I look at this one boulder, and I start laughing. And it's a fried egg. And it truly looks like a fried egg to me, or something else. And that wonder of metaphor, and then to go about the process of photographing it so that it actually looks the way you see it up here, which one of the questions people have to me is, do you alter your work? No, it's exactly the way I see it in my mind's eye. And I really mean that. Do I use processing tools? Sure, and so did Ansel Adams. Anyone that thinks it came out of the camera that way, just not the case. But I don't take like parts and put it in another image, or alter things beyond the way they are, the way I see and feel them. And I felt this was a fried egg, and that's the way I wanted to photograph it. Really fascinating to keyword your images, keyword yourself. And I don't mean location as in Manhattan. I mean a set of emotional keywords. So I tell all my students, typically come up with 50 keywords that describe your images, and 50 keywords that describe yourself. Then start looking at your images and see which of those keywords are present in every image. You may find new keywords. You may quickly find images that don't work, or in my case, I can say that in my current portfolio, 90% of my keywords exist in every single image. And it's a really fascinating process. The second part of it is to keyword yourself and then see what the correlation is between how you view yourself and what you see in your images, and back and forth. And it's a fascinating learning experience. And for me, it's helped an immense amount in terms of bringing my work forward when I actually know what I'm looking for. Instead of looking for a rock, I'm looking at metaphor. Those little things make a really, really big difference. And I would suggest taking your highlights or your top 10 keywords for yourself and your top 10 keywords for your image, put them in boldface and look at them. And when you're editing your images, it is amazingly easy for me to edit when I go back to the keywords. Does this have sensuality? Does this have, is it compacted space? Does it have all the things that I want in my images? And it makes the editing process much more realistic and much more real for me. The process of tracking your influences, going back, and I thought this was a really dumb exercise when I first heard about it, and I had one of the biggest discoveries, which you'll see in here. It was obvious for me that Jay Maisel was a huge influence on my work. If you look at my work, I'm honored that I found him. Not a big surprise, but total love and respect. Pete Turner, and yes, I love volcanoes, and I remember this series of images. It's glued in my head. This image, I looked at for so long thinking this was so ridiculously simple, and why does it work so well? And you know, so many people go out and photograph this and it would just look like a garbage can. And there's so many little things. I always joke that one of the differences between Jay and Pete is Jay would have the red and the yellow, but Pete would put the little green line in there a little bit just to change it. I remember the image of Susan Meiselis's, and first thinking that they were just handprints, and then realizing that was the handprints of the Death Squad. And I wanted to be a war photographer for a point in my life. Very glad I didn't take that route. But to this day, I see handprints on anywheres, and I photograph those handprints. It's not in any way to copy Susan, it's actually to honor her influence that she's had on me. Bresson, pretty obvious for me. Elliot Erwitt, pretty obvious for me. Eric Miola, pretty obvious for me. This was just doing the exercise. Jody Cobb, Eugene Smith, Arnold Newman, Robert Capa, Neil Leifer. Reason here was technically this is one of the most brilliant images I've ever seen, because not only did he get one, he had a camera mounted on the ceiling at Madison Square Garden and pressed that with his foot and got the knockout punch at the same time from right in front as well as from up above, when all the other photographers are standing behind getting absolutely nothing. Dorothy Lang, Ernst Haas. And the wake up for me was this. And when I met my wife, we actually met in Sicily, and I was attracted to a series of boats. And I made some pretty lame pictures looking up at the bow of a boat that probably all of you have done as well. But I found I had this magnetic attraction to bows of boats, and I figured someday I'm going to make an image that actually works. It wasn't until I did this exercise that I realized that this influenced me. And it wasn't until I did this exercise that I realized it hangs in my brother's room. And amazing, for 40 years, I'm looking at this every day. It never, ever, ever occurred to me how much impact it had until I did this exercise. And then lastly, hanging in my own room, growing up with, was the Escher. And it never ever occurred to me photographically that Escher had an influence. But like for 40 years of my life, I woke up in the morning and I looked at this. So as stupid as you think this exercise may be, it's really fascinating to go through the process and do it and see what artists, and they don't all have to be photographers, whether it's, you know, whatever type of artist or music, how it influences your life, and see if it's present in your work. So, a little technique stuff. We associate similar colors more than we associate the shapes. And these are just little art things that I've acquired over the years. It's not like I take out a book in the field, but they're definitely present in my mind when I'm doing all this stuff. So the first thing you see is yellow and blue before you see circles and triangles. Really interesting to know that when I'm out shooting, because if I know that the color is going to hit me before the shapes, that's important when I'm composing something like this. I realize that the set of shapes here are going to help the composition, but the first thing that's going to hit me is those differences in color. Smooth shapes, they present stability, calm, peace. Maybe because they're not fighting gravity. Real simple concept, but really useful to take out and practice in the field. And I saw this. We talk about, people say, how many lenses do you take out with you? One. I pick a lens for the day. That's what I walk around. Because I am actually the kind of person, if I have 10 lenses, I spend the majority of my time thinking that the picture is from the lens that I don't have, and I go back into the camera bag to get the other one. As soon as I put that on, I see the wide-angle shot that I had on originally, and there's nothing more frustrating than that. If I put on a lens, I see with that lens. And if I have these principles in the back of my mind, it's really useful to look at something and know right away how I want to frame this, because I want it to come off as peaceful. Even when, and again, here's optical illusion, which is always something that this comes back from my Escher work, but really interesting to be with a group of photographers and saw and watch how they each photographed this iceberg. Some people photographed just a reflection. Some people photographed just the small icebergs against the bigger iceberg. No one in the group that I was at did this as a whole. And when I asked why, because it seemed so obvious to me, the answer I got was, wow, I actually didn't really see the relationship between all three. And it's not, you know, you have eyes, it's right there, but we each perceive the world differently. I went back to this principle of I want it to be calm. I like this concept of optical illusion. For me, it's hitting me over the head, but it's understanding those principles that makes it happen. A triangle on a flat base also gives a sense of peace and stability. So again, to me, it seemed obvious going to Namibia, and I look at this and I see, oh, triangle on a flat base. That's perfect. And you know, it's not like I carry this book around with me, but I do carry it around up here, and I see things, and it makes a really big difference because I tend not to put a lens on and start going like this. I go, wow, I need that. Bing, I need that. On and forward. Same thing, this is actually in South America. And I love the concept of the triangle on the flat base, but then putting in the compacted space and bringing you from the foreground to the background through this image. And it looks rounded. Again, people ask me all the time, you know, is it Photoshop? No. So this will bring back to the one I showed before. Triangle and a half moon creates a sensation that it's floating in space. And that brings me right to that image I showed before, and that is the triangle and a half moon, and that's why it's floating. Even though I knew that, I couldn't resist, because I didn't want the footprints there, but after I shot, I went up and I literally went like this to make sure that this wasn't magic. The irony is, shooting with me was my business partner, John Paul, who floats stones regularly in his work in Photoshop. And I was just laughing that it was the magic of JP being next to me that was floating this stone for me. But fascinating to see it and really look at it like it's floating. I mean, it was floating. Vertical shapes, much more exciting. They defy gravity. It's a tribute to kinetic energy. And again, knowing that, I know what lens and how I want to photograph this iceberg. I want this iceberg to be in your face and dominating. Very, very different. It also helps spontaneity with shooting, because I'm not looking at something and trying to figure out what's there. I'm seeing what's there and trying to capture it the way I feel. But we can have a big, tall shape. And we put a top on it, which is what they did in ancient Greek architecture, and suddenly it's calming. So in Antarctica, big, tall, in-your-face iceberg, and suddenly it doesn't look as imposing as the other one, and in part because I have this top across it. We read diagonals from left to right, up and down. We want the diagonal to deliver when it takes you someplace. So in Greenland, middle of nowhere, near the North Pole, and there's a jet that goes by. And everyone else that I have in my class is like, I can't believe we're in Greenland and we have to see jet trails. And I'm like, I can't believe it either, but it's awesome. And to use that, you know, and make the moment. And if I did use Photoshop, I would move the diagonal up a hair, but I don't. I mean, it's not, I don't want to alter the reality of the way I saw it. But everyone else waited for the jet to leave. And I said, so then you just have an iceberg that leads to nowhere. And then it's like, you like the jet trail? Well, I would prefer not to see jets up here either, but if they're going to be here, I don't mind using it to help make the image stronger. Same concept, going to photograph the Northern Lights. Spectacular thing to see, spectacular thing to feel. And the first place that I decide to shoot, first thing I see are the city lights of Reykjavik behind the mountain. And everyone says, oh my God, like really, this is where you picked? We have this awful bright yellow light from the city? And I said, I honestly didn't take into consideration that we would see the city lights from here. But this might be very cool. And it completely works because it looks to me like a spotlight. Again, I like optical illusions, but it looks like this spotlight coming up. And otherwise it would have just been an aurora. We happen to get a meteor going across, which doesn't hurt. But it's those surprises, and it's those things that break rules. The best rule of all is that there are none, by the way. Even though I have all these rules, the number one rule is that there are no rules. It's nice to have some guidelines, though. Again, seeing something that works not the way you anticipate it's going to happen. And I love the camels, and I actually shot this multiple ways without him in there at all, with him in there just a little bit. But the surprise is really fantastic. As patterns get smaller, we follow the patterns back. They help create a sense of energy. They bring a dynamic quality to everything. Really useful to go to the Atacama Desert and immediately see these patterns and know up here how they're going to work. I want to follow that right back. In Bolivia, same thing. I want to follow it back, and I want something to be delivered when I get there. So having the clouds rising up in the background, really useful. The idea of where we place an object. Higher up in the quadrant gives a sense of spirituality or a sense of freedom. And it works. And knowing this ahead of time It's a very different way of looking at the world. If you have an idea of what it represents to you or how you feel about it, it's much easier to photograph than to look at it and go, okay, so it's a rock. What am I going to do with it? If I look at it and I go, it feels spiritual to me, now I know what I'm going to do with it. And there's always something that's just magic called the luck. And in Japan, have the Torii Gate, had the fog, and there was nothing going on above it, and it just didn't work. And I watched this cloud come across from all the way left, slowest traveling cloud I ever saw. And I'm reminded, and it's something we can't do, there's this magnet that happens. You have to take pictures even though you know it's not there yet. And I counted how many frames I shot as that cloud went across, even though I knew there's only going to be one frame where it lines up. But the hand just, it's like the magic of deleting later is enjoyable. But it finally made it across. And then there's something there, so the picture works. Again, higher up gives this sense of spirituality. Even photographing sports, and really fun to go out and photograph something like kite surfing, but do it in a way that I feel it, as opposed to just the way I've seen it in Sports Illustrated. Real simple concept. Object on a light background, object on a dark background. This is the exact same iceberg field, and watch the difference. So on a light background, I'm on one side of the iceberg, and it's mystical, feels light, feels airy. Go around to the other side where these storm clouds are now behind me. Have an object on a black background. That's the same iceberg. And completely different feeling. Really useful to know that ahead of time, as opposed to chance or what is it going to look like. Knowing what it's going to look like, what it feels like, critical. Sensuality is important to me. Curves are important to me. I actually trace back, growing up, I was a competitive skier. I love S-turns. I did not like football and baseball because they were squiggly lines. I didn't like squiggly lines. I liked S-curves. I like S-curves as part of sensuality. Again, really useful to go someplace and start finding these curves, and instead of seeing a desert, I start seeing a human body or forms and shape that are a metaphor for something else. When an object is small, it feels vulnerable. Really big decision in what lens I'm going to use, because I have this massive iceberg. Everyone else has a long lens on and they want to isolate the iceberg. And I'm like, no, I actually like the quality of it being alone and sitting there in the world by itself. Really useful. Really important. So many images we look at have what I call a stage with no actor. The vista of walking up to the Grand Canyon and taking out your camera and shooting the same picture that's going to be the same way in a minute from now and 10 minutes from now. There's nothing going on. They're beautiful, but there's no actor. To me, an image needs a stage and an actor, and sometimes a secondary actor or a third actor, and the number one actor doesn't always have to be the big giant actor. So, again, really useful in Buenos Aires, and I've got a great stage, and I've got no actor. And there's nothing that I can do this. I want to like this, but without a cat in that window or a woman in that window or something else going on, it's just gonna vogue at me and go, I could be really good, but I'm not. To identify that, really important. And the actor doesn't always have to be huge in the frame. So I remember going to photograph the volcano in Iceland, and my gut, I wanted, because I like to be right up there, I wanted to go right up to the eruption, and I did. and it so didn't work. It was neat, but much more powerful image to keep this in mind. And I have the stage. My main actor is very tiny. I've got secondary actors of the clouds. I've got a third actor of the secondary eruption coming up through. I've got the stars. And you know it's going to work. Really helpful to identify it that way. Antarctica. And yes, I am known to go in a lot of places where sometimes you shouldn't necessarily venture, but it's so awesome. Going under an iceberg, still just a stage. Having the drop of water come down from the roof of the iceberg and capturing it, now I have my actor. Now it works. Really interesting to, again, going back to my roots of loving optical illusion, to see what happens when light and dark or shadow comes into an image, how it can change your perception of reality. So, is the dark iceberg in the front or the white iceberg in the front? Before you all think you know the answer, if you look at the little point like that, you have to decide whether that's a drip or whether that's a crack in the other iceberg. And the answer is the white iceberg is in front of the black iceberg. But you can get your mind to go either way, all based on whether you see that as a drip or a V. Okay, now again, this one, really fascinating. I'm in Africa. I admit I had a little vodka in my orange juice in the morning, and I photographed lion prints. And I came back and I looked at this and I said to the person I'm with, okay, this is driving me nuts, because when lions walk on the sand, it goes in. And he's like, well, whatever. I'm like, no, not whatever. The lion weighs 500 pounds. It steps in the sand goes in. I see this as coming out. Okay, it's the same photograph. It's just flipped. So it's where your brain places the shadow. Now, the really neat thing is some of you see this as indented and can't understand how I see it as coming out, and you see it the other way. You can actually stare at it and get your mind to reverse it on you. It's all about the importance of shadow. And when you start thinking about how shadow, so many people either avoid shadows altogether. Shadows are bad. Shadows are awesome. And if you start understanding what the shadow can do, you can make the shadow completely play tricks on your images. When I was learning how to light commercially, this guy over here told me there's one light that's awesome, and it's called the sun. And I never, ever, ever forgot the importance of not having to light an entire factory and arena, but going back to the concept of, yeah, you know what? There's one light in the right place. It totally can be magical. When we have a window or an opening, we want to travel through it. We want to see what's delivered on the other side of the window. Really useful to know that ahead of time, because otherwise I have just an arch. But getting a reward, getting something delivered when we look through there, really important. We like repetitive patterns. Simple concept. Really useful to put it to work. Greenland, where I'm going this is what I was talking about, and just amazing to see those patterns. We like repetitive patterns, but we also like a break in a repetitive pattern. So again, really useful to have that up here, come across a sand dune, and go, yeah, the repetitive pattern is neat, but if I find that break in that pattern, that's even neater. Keeping that rule and going back to what's true to your heart and your influences, and I'm not saying it because he's here, but when I pressed the button on this shutter, he was completely in my head, 100%, and I really felt that Jay was around me because it was so much of what I had learned from him. But awesome to see the repetitive pattern, and then this break in it, and the silhouette and everything else coming together. Using screens, and all kinds of natural screens, create depth, create impact. Really simple image, but through the screen takes on a different role. I got yelled at in France because you're not allowed to take pictures in the museum. I wasn't photographing the art. I'm photographing through the window shade on Paris, and all I could think of is I was just looking at a Monet, and now I got a Monet right in front of me. The guard doesn't quite understand that. And then they start wondering if you're a terrorist or something, because why would you be photographing outside? Well, if I can't photograph inside, doesn't work. Same concept in Japan. Love the torii gates, but this is a reflection actually in a building that has metal, four-sided metal going around, so it's a reflection in a reflection. The whole idea of metaphor in general and knowing how you feel about something can help make an image much more powerful. So I'm doing a body of work on sensuality in nature, and really interesting to go out and find in nature, not with Photoshop, things that appeal to that. Humor, something else. I mean, we all love it. These two penguins were embarrassed by the other guy that couldn't stand on the ice. Hilarious. And he kept trying to get back on the ice. And they kept like looking over their shoulders like, get away from us. Something as simple as opposite or complementary colors. And it starts, you know it's going to work. Now, I don't really have the actor here, so I'm not showing it, again, I'm not showing portfolio images, I'm showing images to talk about certain concepts. A tribute to my mentor. Watch out for triangles in the corner. So a really interesting example of it, is just an iguana. And I've got these two killer triangles, one in the top right, one in the top left. It's what I would call a 3. It's an okay image. But reframing it and just going in tighter and getting rid of those two triangles takes the image up a big step. Border patrol. Watch what's around the edges. It can significantly take an image up in quality. So I've got stuff around the top, stuff around the bottom. Just go in a little tighter. And Mr. Maisel, triangles are not always bad. So in this case, the whole image is triangles, and it works, in my belief, is that if the triangle is more than a third of the frame, it can help actually set up the frame to work correctly. When it's less than a third of the frame, and especially it's in a corner, it really is distractive. So, and there's to me the division line of where it works. If that shadow was further down, even a little bit, it simply wouldn't work. We can argue about this, it'd be fun too. Sharp edges. Really interesting how they play on our sense of depth. So if we look at this image, is the building in the foreground or is it in the background? And when I photograph it wide and I have dark light, it's clearly in the background. When I come in tighter, same lens, same building, it jumps to the foreground. Again, knowing those kinds of things, really, really useful. Playing with perspective or point of view. So I had a job to photograph the city of Miami and how to work with an art director that didn't have a whole lot of respect for it. So I get a drawing, and the drawing is the city of Miami and someone parasailing in front of it. And I said, I see that picture every day. How about we shoot that and we don't show the parasail? And the art director's like, so I saw it as an opportunity to take my wife parasailing and get paid for it. And it's awesome. And it became the heart of their campaign. The art director could not envision this working. But you don't need the parasail. Totally talks about parasailing. It ended up becoming the lead campaign, which of course the art director then takes credit for. But that's a different story. Being a participant and not an observer. For those who showed me portfolios yesterday, was something I asked you to look at. It's okay, but I'm an observer. Now I'm a participant. And how we frame something, how close we get, the relationship that we build, and it doesn't mean you talk to somebody for an hour, but the relationship that you have with the subject makes the difference between being an observer or a participant. I am running out of time. No such thing as bad light. It's just different light. So, first trip to Antarctica. We see our first iceberg, and it hits me what it's going to be like to take 70 photographers to Antarctica. The entire ship goes up on its side as 70 photographers go to the side of the boat. And I'm like, there's nothing here. And then the captain announces, we're going into bad light and a storm. So everybody starts leaving the deck. And the only one up on the deck is John Paul Caponegro and I. And it's still not that good. Storm starts coming in. Okay. Storm keeps coming in. It gets darker and darker and darker. I throw on a lens and I'm like, oh my God, this is awesome light. I look over and I have a 400 with a 2X on. I really wanted a 6. And I look over and there's JP with a 24. And I'm like, are you kidding me? You know, like, there's JP's picture. Spectacular and so much fun to shoot with someone, not to copy them but to see how they see the world. Next day, he comes out with a long lens, and of course I come out with a 24. And to this day, we both joke about it, and we're in the Zodiacs, we both have long, and he's like, you see it long or you see it wide? I'm like, I don't know. Anyhow, I'm supposed to end it. I could go on for another 3 hours right now, but they're going to kick me off. I know it was different than... Thank you.